All right. So welcome everyone. Sorry for that small little technical hitch, but we are coming up to this very special eclipse. So the energy is very high, longest day of the year. And I'm really thrilled to be continuing this series of interviews all about the journey of self-love and how different souls on that journey have developed certain specializations. So this is the third in the series. The first one we had a beautiful young lady I met in Bali last year called Jody, who was talking about detoxification. And then I was talking last week with another beautiful friend of mine. We were talking about the birth process and how to be really in a very conscious way around birth. And it was an incredible interview. And this week, we're going to be talking to another friend of mine that I met in Bali. So Bali seems to be the meeting ground for me last year for all sorts of new wonderful friends. So I'm really, soul friends, I would call them. So I'm really, really very happy about that. So yeah, Bali seems to have been last year for me a very special place. Those of you that have been there, you know a little bit about it. So today I'm going to be interviewing Gary Cousins, who, like me, has had a lifelong passion for astrology. And also, like me, has had a lifelong interest in relationships, and especially intimate relationships. So we're going to be diving into those subjects today. And I must admit, Gary is one of my, very best new male friends in my life. I've been very blessed to have these incredible male friends, and I really count Gary as one of them. What I loved about Gary when I first met him was his amazing practicality and groundedness. I always felt that he was very present and very grounded and very practical. And he's one of these men that I think is bringing this new spirituality into the world, and it's a grounded spirituality. And it's a great honor for me to introduce you to Gary and dive deep into this amazing world of the quantum world, intimate relationships, and astrology. So it's with great pleasure that I'll invite Gary just to bring up his camera now, and you can all meet him and we can all say hi. And let's, how do we make, I think you can, here I go. I just minimize it, and there you go. There we go.
There you go. Hello, Andrew.
Hey, good to see you, my
friend.
friend.
Nice to be on this call with you and to meet everybody and to talk about passions around astrology, especially at this time with the solstice happening for me in the early hours of tomorrow morning. And it's not just a solstice, it's also a new moon. And it's not just a new moon, it's a solar eclipse. And that doesn't happen very often.
Right. Yeah. My energy levels have been off the roof as we come up to this solstice. I don't know about yours, but mine have been off the roof.
So no, certainly it's been a day where definitely feeling a lot of energies. And we this is actually just, we'll get into the topic of our discussion, but just because while we're talking about solstices, this is actually the first bookend of two bookends. We have the first solstice now, the summer-winter solstice. So for you people in the Northern Hemisphere, it's the summer solstice, longest day of the year. And on the 21st of December, we have the next solstice. So this solstice is unique in that we have an eclipse and a new moon falling on the day of the solstice. That's very rare. And it's even more rare in that the eclipse actually aligns with what's known as the galactic cross. And that's the Native Americans speak that when there's an alignment, that place in the Milky Way is where souls come in and out and where purification takes place. So an eclipse is an activator. Then at the end of the year, on the 21st of December, on the day of the solstice, we have the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, which only takes place every 20 years. And for it to fall on the solstice is extremely rare. So we have these two bookends, kind of like saying the next 6 months are booked by both incredibly very rare spotlights. An eclipse, if we just talk about what's happening tomorrow, an eclipse is a activation energy. So it's a very powerful time, and we're moving into the next 6 months, and there's a lot more astrology to talk about. for the next 6 months, but that's not what we're here to talk about. we have some other astrology. So just to kind of keep it short, this is the beginning of a very powerful 6 months, and all new moons are really important because they allow us to set intentions for the next month. But being the solstice, it allows us to set intentions for the next 6 months. So the energies and the intentions we hold tomorrow are really critical. So that's all I'll say just about the astrology of the next 6 months. But then there's a lot more that we can talk about, but that's subject for another conversation. So
okay. So what I like to do with all my guests at the beginning is just to have them talk a little bit about their own journey of self-love. And then what I'll do is, if you could just give a brief, I know it's difficult to compact a whole life into a few sentences, but I think you could rise yourself to that challenge. And then I'm going to ask you about some of the subjects that we've agreed that we're going to be talking about. So, Gary, what led you onto this journey of self-love, and what have you discovered about it?
So the journey for me, okay, so just to answer your question, you were asking, summarize a lifetime. So I'm just going to say that in short, my passions throughout my lifetime has been science and physics, and that led me to becoming an engineer. And shortly after I completed my university studies, which was a very long time ago, my uncle said to me, "Have you considered looking into astrology?" I didn't know anything about astrology. And this was about 27, 28 years ago that I started looking into astrology. Anyway, and I started studying astrology. And as you know, Andrew, astrology is a subject of many different rabbit holes that you can go down, and they're bottomless. And and I've basically over the years have specialized into what's known as traditional astrology, which is really the astrology practiced from about the Middle Ages through until the Renaissance period, until the late 1700s. And then there was astrology kind of in the Western world kind of just disappeared. For about 100 years in the West, astrology disappeared. And then it was revived in the late 1900s. The late 19th century, let's say the early 19th century. But yeah, so astrology's been a passion of mine. And then, as I say, quantum physics just is one of the most captivating, incredible, mind-twisting pieces of physics. Also, pretty much birthed into human consciousness in the early 1900s. Max Planck and Niels Bohr and various people like that formulated quantum theory. And many of the things that were discovered in quantum physics, Einstein himself had a lot of problems with. He started looking at things like quantum teleportation, which is now the foundation of the quantum computer, which is currently being developed and built by computer scientists and physicists around the world. And Einstein is famously quoted as saying, "God does not play dice with the universe." And what he really meant by that is a whole discussion, which we won't get into. It's the deeper aspects of quantum physics. But I think the important thing about quantum physics and how it relates to our subject of relationships, because that to me is the other, I think most people are really into relationships. We all here because of relationships. But what do relationships have to do with quantum physics, you might ask? And
that was going to be my question, Gary. It's on the list. The quantum nature of relationships. So maybe you could go into that because it's fascinating. Yeah.
So the world of physics is pretty much, Isaac Newton came along and discovered the famous mythical stories that he was sitting under the apple tree and the apple fell on his head, and he said, what made the apple fall? And he thought of gravity, and he started coming up with the laws of physics, and everybody's kind of familiar with Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so we created a whole physics. Then quantum physics came along and basically turned all of that physics on its head. And we started getting all kinds of strange behaviors where particles kind of existed and disappear, and suddenly at the atomic level of the electron, an electron can just cease to exist. Or what we've now discovered in quantum teleportation, an electron can be in two places at the same time and can be interconnected, and you can do something to the one, and the other interconnected particle literally teleports information between the two of them without any time difference. And this is called quantum teleportation, and it's beyond what anybody can really grasp. But we're building computers that use this technology. So how does this go back to relationships?
Sure.
So about the same time as I started studying astrology, I started reading a very important book by a quantum physicist from Oxford University. Her name is Dana Zohar. That's D-A-N-A-H, Zohar, Z-O-H-A-R. And she wrote a book in 1991 called The Quantum Self. She subsequently wrote a book called The Quantum Society, The Quantum Business, and she went on to basically, speak about a whole society that humanity is moving into. But let's just stick to her first book, and that really changed my viewpoint of reality and viewpoint of relationships. She shows in her book, The Quantum Self, that when two people come together, they literally create a third entity, which she shows from quantum physics actually exists and comes into being, called the quantum self. And when two people come together, this third quantum self exists. And I looked at this and I thought, you know what, this is really fascinating, because the mystics throughout time speak of the beloved. And who is the beloved? The beloved is the God that we see in each other. And we cultivate this relationship and this entity called the beloved and called the quantum self. And this quantum self exists. And she shows in her book, and she proves using physics, that even if two people split up, this third entity that was created by the coming together of two people continues to exist for all of eternity.
Wow.
And this just blew my mind. And I started thinking about it and started thinking, like, how does this work? And how do we actually work with this in terms of our relationships? And the fascinating thing about quantum physics, and we'll get to it later, this is the astrological work that I've been doing, combining quantum physics philosophy with astrology, and we'll get to that in a moment. But the fascinating thing about quantum physics is that quantum reality exists in a dimension of probability. And when we observe the quantum state, it's what's known as the quantum probability function collapses and reality emerges. Now, that's maybe difficult to grasp what I just said. So let's use a simple example. One of the famous quantum physicists from the early 1900s, Erwin Schrödinger, came up with a very famous, in the quantum physics world, thought experiment called Schrödinger's cat. And basically what he did was he said, We will put a cat in a box, and inside the box we'll put some poison. And the poison is released when a quantum particle is released. Now, the fascinating thing, the only true randomness in nature is the quantum physics world. Everything else is not random. Even if you throw the dice or you go to the casino, there is no real randomness there taking place. Real, true quantum or randomness in the quantum world only comes about through quantum particles such as an electron. So basically, this particle at some random point will release the poison, but the box is closed. So Schrodinger's thought experiment, and all of this can be written and explained using the mathematics of quantum physics, which is way beyond my understanding and most people's, but nevertheless, it's proven. And they've done experiments now with quantum teleportation to prove that this is the case. And basically, until we open the box, we don't know if the cat is dead or alive. So the cat exists in a state called the qubit. It's neither a 1 nor a 0, and this is how we build a quantum computer. Normal computers, and the computers we are using right now, work in what's known as binary, and there are switches, billions of switches inside my computer that make up the processor, and it's either on or off, and we get binary mathematics, and that leads to how computers work. But a quantum computer exists in something called the qubits, and a qubit is neither a 1 nor a 0, but only when we look to see what it is does it collapse into a 1 or a 0. And in the analogy of the cat is either dead or alive. Okay, so now let's get back to what on earth has this got to do with relationships? Now, the fascinating thing about relationships is that as we get in a relationship with one another, Donna Zoa has shown through her book that when two people come together in a relationship, they create this new quantum which exists for all of eternity. And as we connect with one another, as we observe one another, because the interesting thing about the quantum world is that the first fundamental experiment of quantum physics, which completely befuddled the physicists of the day, was an electron can be either a wave or a particle, but it can't be both at the same time. So they did these really interesting experiments to see, is it a particle or a wave? And when they observed, it became either a particle or a wave. And somehow they started seeing that the electrons seem to know what we're doing. And similarly, in a relationship, as we observe one another, as we are present in the relationship with our beloved, we literally collapse the quantum probability of what this relationship could become. And we literally create a reality of this third entity becoming more and more real. Because in the quantum experiment of Schrodinger's cat and in quantum computers, the qubit, or the cat in the box, it's the same thing, actually exists in a ghost state of a probability that has not yet been realized until we observe. And it's very similar in a relationship. Until we truly become present with our partner and really observe the beloved that is in the other, do we actually create the probability, or we collapse the probability and we create something really tangible. And if I bring this back to astrology, in astrology, we have an interesting technique. We can take the astrology chart of the one person, and we can take the astrology chart of the other person. We can look at how they interact with each other, and we can see how does these two people get on and how is this relationship going to work. But there's another technique in astrology where we can actually merge these two charts. It's called the composite chart. And that chart is the chart of the relationship. It's like a third entity, just like in quantum physics. And we are able to basically observe what's happening to this third entity chart, and we can see the progression of the relationship. But if two people basically stop observing one another, they actually stop the development of this third entity. I hope I'm making sense, because it can get quite.
Yeah, I think I can clarify it maybe, because I have. Let's take it into practicalities. So
Yeah.
So when you say, for example, so the first thing that comes up for me, Gary, when you talk about this, is obviously when most people come together and they commit to each other, what tends to happen is a lot of deeper emotions start to come out. So what I hear you saying is that if you don't get so caught up in those emotions, which are really the yin yang, and you sort of try and observe it more and be more compassionate with each other, that this third entity, there's the possibility for this third entity actually arising and the destiny of that relationship, really shifting. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
You got it spot on. So basically, yeah, exactly. So what happens when people typically come together, and this we can see through astrology and through astrology charts, we can see where are the clashes, where are the harmonious interactions. But there is this third entity which will exist for all of eternity. Quantum physics proves this.
Right.
But the way I seem to, my sense of how it works is that the solidity of this third entity is something that gets more and more solid as the relationship develops. In other words, let's put it this way, the one. I mean, I get many clients who ask me this question, is he the one? And that's a whole nother story. But
sure.
the essence of it is that if I look deeply into you and you look deeply into me, ultimately all I see is God, and all you see is God, and it's God looking at God. But our egos don't allow us to see that ultimate truth.
Yeah.
So we tend to get caught, exactly as you said. People come together and the stuff of the ego meshes together. But if we can get still enough and we can truly observe, then this probability function collapses and this third entity can arise.
Beautiful, Gary. Beautiful.
And
I guess, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Gary.
No. And that to me is what I got out of the Quantum Self book from Dana Zohar, which I highly recommend people read. It's not available in Kindle. It's only available in paperback, but it's still in print. And it is a profound book, and she went on to write many books, and she's now, like very involved in what she calls quantum business. But that there is, as we observe quantum states, they come out of the realm of probability of ghost cats in boxes, and they become real,
So the first thing that sort of occurs to me is that in all relationships, we also get attached to the good qualities, of our partner. We, especially in the beginning of the relationship, we're so sort of seduced by it, right? And anyone that's been in a long-term relationship will know that after the initial honeymoon period, we start to see the shadow, and so everyone goes through that journey. So it's not just the negative things, it's just the fact that we get caught up in this idea of you and me, right? That's basically what you're saying.
And ultimately, the question is he the one or is she the one? The answer is the one exists in all of us. When I quote the Bible, Jesus said, where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst, you know. And
Right.
when we come together, the one results, you know, God comes into being.
Wow.
But our ego, we don't see the beloved, you know,
Right.
and we get caught. And ultimately, everyone is the one, and we can find the one in whoever we find. But the question is, are we willing to get present enough to truly see past all of the ego stuff and ultimately see that the one is looking back at us through the eyes of our beloved?
Right. I guess I want to ask a question for everyone who's watching. So it's easy to say, but to actually live it is another story, I think.
Yeah.
And
And that is,
especially when you have a lot of strong emotions coming up, say, you know.
yeah. So, I mean, you know, the truth is, of course, there are relationships, people try and make them work. And there is a lot of stuff, a lot of ego stuff that just makes it really, really difficult and really, really hard work. And, you know, I've had many couples come to me, and, you know, the astrology shows that for it to work, it's a lot of hard work. And for a lot of couples, it comes to a choice of like, well, you know, there's so much disharmony. They're trying to make so much stuff join together, and it just doesn't work. And you can see that, you know, the best course of action would be to separate. But actually, if we really had to strip away all of the ego, we would just be pure spirit. And pure spirit would only just be the beloved. But so to get back to, you know, yes, there are relationships that it's going to be a struggle to make it work. But there's also aspects of like people often sometimes give up too quickly in relationships because, you know, and that's what astrology has taught me, is that life is cyclical. We don't live in linear time. We live in cyclical time, and there's other levels of time, but I don't want to get into a whole discussion of the philosophy of time.
Could you explain cyclical time though, Gary? Could you just explain that?
Yeah.
Because maybe some
Okay.
people don't understand.
So what astrology teaches us is that everything is a cycle. There's a cycle of 1 year. There's a cycle of 1 month, which the moon is a cycle of 1 month. The sun is a cycle of 1 year. Saturn is a cycle of 29 years. Jupiter is a cycle of 12 years. So we get to revisit certain aspects of our lives on different time periods, depending on these planetary cycles. And the way I like to look at life is that life is a journey forward along a linear path, but it's a spiral. It's a spiral that's going up. And we kind of move around in these cycles, and we can then revisit. So, you know, we have to realize that life is the cycles. There are these cycles and cycles, and we can. Does that answer your question? The question.
Yeah, I think it's I was just wanting to get that clarification for you on what cycles meant, and so I understand totally. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Because it's maybe some people that was, you know, challenging to understand that, because most people think of time as like this linear thing, right? You know, it's just going like this, but actually what you're saying is that it's actually spiraling as we move, you know, so you have both within that in some way.
Yeah. So to get back to kind of relationships, you know, is that sure, there's, you know, so what I was trying to say was that getting back to the thread of what I was saying, which led to cyclical time, is that, you know, the problem in many relationships is that people get to a time of the relationship dies. And what astrology has taught me is that, for every death, there is a rebirth. And so many people, particularly in our Western world, have this viewpoint of like, I'm born, I continue along this linear path, and I die. But in Eastern 90% of Eastern philosophy, and certainly astrological philosophy, is that everything is a cycle. We get born, the cycle of death comes, we die, and there's a rebirth. So in relationships, what astrology has been so helpful for me and for my clients is to be able to show people that right now your relationship is in a death period. And if you can just hang in there for another 3 or 4 months, or 5 months, or 6 months, or 2 years, and maybe you need to go through 6 months of no sexual activity. And for many men, that is like an absolute, I can't go on. But you know what? You can. Because I've been through it. And I know many men have said, you know what? Let's go into a period of celibacy where our sexual relationship is in a death period. And then as the planets move, as these cycles change, as we move up the spiral, a new spark of life comes back into the relationship. And so many people in our world today, I mean, we see it on the statistics of divorce. More than 50% of marriages in the West end in divorce. Because people don't have this understanding of the cyclical nature of time and the birth and rebirth and death cycles that happen in our lives. That so much, we get to places in our lives where we think, I'm just depressed, I can't go on. But if you could see that you're just in a cycle, a downward cycle, a spiral down into the depths, into the shadow, into the darkness, and that there's a journey, and that's what astrology teaches. Because there are these stories of Pluto. Pluto abducts Persephone and takes her down into the underworld. And the story goes that I was just talking about these cycles of death that we get to experience in our lives. And it's not always death, it's just cycles of growth, that there's infinite growth cannot continue. There has to be a time for rebirth and renewal. And so these are the cycles of, this is what astrology has really taught to me and really helped me and my clients in their relationships. But it's been this understanding of the sort of quantum nature of relationships that has been very profound for me to really sort of see that there's, to answer the question, yes, we discover the one through the journey of relationship. And in that journey of relationship, there will come times when it seems like the one is very far away.
So I guess I know me personally, I've been through quite a few of those in my life, and I've learned to trust them more. But when you're in them, it doesn't really get easier. The only thing that pulls you through, I think, this is my experience, was the trust of the time you went through it before. That's been my experience. Has that been yours? That seems to be the thing that pulls you through,
It is the thing that pulls you through. And, sometimes it's obviously very hard. I mean, certainly in my own life, I'm in my second marriage. And, after my first marriage, after I got divorced, it was like, never again. I'm not getting married again. And I certainly ain't having children again.
Wow.
But the universe had bigger plans for me, It's like next minute, I met somebody, I met my wife. I just got told by the universe and through various synchronicities and through various astrological and things that I'm getting married again. I'm going to have 2 children again. And yeah, okay, well, all right, I surrender.
Do you
But
remember that time? Did you have like an internal conflict, or was it, or did you feel
yeah,
like there was some sort of guidance, or was there some conflict
no,
in you?
there was this, definitely I went there, I don't want to get married again. But then suddenly there was this voice inside which said, you know, and there were signs, you know, as an astrologer, I look for signs. I look for signs in the sky. I look for signs in my chart. I look for signs in nature, shamanic signs. And I saw all these signs, and then I started asking questions. So I practice my speciality in astrology is I practice a form of astrology where you can ask questions. I call it
Wow.
quantum questioning astrology, because
Right.
you can ask a question, and when you observe the question, the probability of what the future might be is observed. Just like in the quantum world, when you observe the quantum state, you suddenly discover it's an electron, or you discover it's a wave. You know, that's Heisenberg's, what's known as Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. We don't know whether the electron is a particle or a wave, but when we observe it, it suddenly becomes one or the other. And
Right.
it's similarly, we all have these questions about our lives. We all have these questions about our relationships, and we ponder, is he the one? Will this relationship work out? Will I get married again? Will I get this job? Will my investment be successful? Will I sell my house before the end of the year? These are all the kind of questions that can be asked in what I call quantum questioning astrology. And the fascinating thing about this form of astrology, it's nothing new. I've just added an understanding of quantum physics to it. But it's an ancient form of astrology that goes back right to the 5th century AD. So we're talking like, you know, more than 2,000 years ago. And it's a very complex system of rules when a question is asked. But the fascinating thing about this form of astrology is that it's not when you first think of the question. It's when you ask the astrologer the question, and the astrologer sits down with you and observes your question. And
Ah.
basically, what's happening there is that you have these questions. But the thing is, we have many questions. You know, if we take it back to our theme of relationships, is he the right one for me? Is this the right relationship? Or is this relationship going to work out? Do I need to get divorced? Should I have a child with this? Will that make the relationship work? We have all of these different questions. And the ancient astrologers, in fact, one of the most famous astrologers from the 13th century called Guido Bonatti from Siena in Italy, he basically says in his writings, he says, say to the person, go away and go and pray to God. And when you've prayed to God, then come back and ask your question. So it's about getting clear with our question. So we're all filled with so many questions. So I like to think of all of these questions are the quantum probabilities of outcomes. We're filled with so many questions. But if we can get truly clear on what our question is, then we can align the question with our intent and our will. And few of us really know how to exercise will. So that's the work I do, is I kind of take people through a process of getting clear on what the question is. And does that question align with your will and your intent? And then go and meditate upon it. Go and contemplate your question. And you know, in fact, you gifted me the book from Richard Rudd on contemplation, the ancient art of contemplation, which again, a few people know about. People know about meditation, but the ancient art of contemplation and to really contemplate what is your question. When you've contemplated your question enough, you then come and ask me the question. And then so you may email me the question, and then I'll sit down and I read your question. I now observe your question. And literally what's happening at that point is the observer effect is coming into play. All of the probabilities collapse. And what's fascinating, this to me is the true magic of this form of astrology, is that the question is totally reflected in the sky for the time and location for me as the astrologer observing your question. I'll give you an example for people who may not understand what I'm saying. Give you an example. I had a client many years ago who came to me on a Thursday morning, and this was back in the day I was still in the corporate world, and she came up to me at a conference on the Thursday, and she said to me, do I go next Wednesday? I booked the appointment for an artificial insemination, or do I wait for Mr. Right to come along?
Wow.
That very morning she asked the question. In the sky, that question is reflected back. Each character in the question is an assigned a planet. There's all these rules. And the planet that represented the partner was the planet Mercury. And many people on this call probably have heard of the concept of Mercury retrograde. In fact, we're in a Mercury retrograde phase right now. Mercury just turned retrograde a few days ago, where he appears to move backwards in the sky, and that's all due to the Earth going a little bit faster on the lane that the Earth's in. So on that day, she asked the question, Mercury turned retrograde. And I always like to think about it, it's like, as she asked the question, she stopped Mercury in the sky, and Mercury turned and moved towards her. And by looking, and again, this is the technicalities of this technique, I could see that, Mercury, the man, was moving towards her and would come to connect with her in a certain period of time, and that was February of the following year. She asked me the question in November, and yes, she met the guy in February. She had a child with him.
Wow.
And she didn't go for, So when we ask the right question, so firstly, one, we have to get correct. We have to get very clear on what is the question. Right. And one of the first things I suggest to people is, because we're all filled with many questions, and a lot of us have a lot of questions. And right now we're living in a time where there's so many questions. It's like, what's going to happen? Will I still have my job? Will I still have my business in 3 months from now during this crazy Corona time? And who knows what's happening? So there's so many questions that we've got. So the first thing I suggest is, ask yourself, am I asking the right question? Just that simple exercise. And then, in the work of contemplation, just use the pauses in the day just to actually pause and just observe those pauses. And that allows us to just, because what happens is that in our world of, hyperstimulation, we don't sit with our questions enough. We just get distracted by our cell phones and by the media, and we just move on. But when we spend time in meditation and when we spend time in contemplation, we can contemplate our questions. We can ask ourselves questions like, is this the right question? Am I asking the right question? And we get very clear, and then we ask questions like, is this question really in alignment with what do I really want? Do I really, really want this? Because sometimes we are very confused because of life and the pressures of life and the demands of our modern world. Right. And then when we get very clear on the right question, we can ask the right question. And then this is the real magic of this kind of astrology, is that your question can then be observed. And then there's this real magic that takes place. You can literally stop the planets in the sky with your question, and you can create a new reality. And that is what That is
Amazing.
what really excites me. I've been
Yeah.
practicing this form of astrology for about 20 years now, and I've had thousands of questions from, outcomes of court cases, business questions, obviously many relationship questions, and so forth. In fact, it can even answer questions like, where is my missing passport? Where is my so there's no question that it can't answer. But it's really about getting very clear with what we really want to ask. And when we get very clear in what we really want to ask, we then basically we take things from the realm of all of the possibilities, and we align with our will, and we create the reality. And getting back to relationships, we create the relationship we really want for our lives.
Got you. So just to get back, because we have a special offer for everyone on the webinar where, I think people have to understand that there's quite a lot of work that goes into it because you have to create the chart, you have to look at the chart. I mean, you have to do a lot of things. So I want to clarify. So you talked about 2 stages here. You talked about one, having the question, but then making sure it's the right question. Is that something that's included in your service where you help people actually really go deep into finding the right question? Is that what's part of your service?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So it's important that people understand that. So
I basically take people through my work in this process is a 3-stage process. One is some dialogue, and either we do it via email or we do it on a video call. We get very clear in understanding what the question is.
Okay.
And that may be take some time. I may say, go and do some contemplation work, go and pray to God, whatever your spiritual path is.
Right.
We will do some work around what I call the right use of will, really aligning with what is your will and how to understand what the right use of your will is, and align that with the question. So that process could take some time. Once we've got the question, we can then ask the question, and then the magic of just that time of when I observe the question or the astrologer observes the question, a chart is cast. Then I'll analyze that chart. And then there's the third part of then actually just, explaining the answer. Sometimes it's very clear. We don't need to spend any time. Other times there may be some explanation required. So it's essentially, it's a 3-stage process.
Got you. And just for this time on this webinar, I think you usually charge $300. You're giving a special offer to anyone who books a question with you right now, and it's only $100. I think it's a brilliant deal. I would jump at it. I would jump at it to have someone like you, 25 years experience in this approach, to get your deepest questions answered. I mean, I think this is an incredible opportunity, folks. I don't want to sound too American, but I think it's a great opportunity.
So I'm very excited to offer this quantum questioning astrology, and I'm excited that we have this offer. So it's just there's limited availability with this offer. There's a couple of questions I see that have come in on the chat.
Yes, there are. I saw those as well.
Maybe we can actually. So the first question I see is Claudette says, how does entanglement affect relationships? And I think that's a really profound one. So if we go back to quantum physics, what they discovered, and this is the basis of how we're building the quantum computer, is that we can take particles of light, photons, or we can take electrons or other subatomic particles. They can be what's known as entangled. I'm not going to go into the whole physics of how it works, but essentially particles have what's called spin, and the particles have spin, and essentially you can take, let's take a simple example. We can split a beam of light, and the particles of light split into 2 separate beams of light, and this is what the first quantum internet communication that's been taking place. In fact, the Chinese set a record a couple of years ago where they basically took light and they sent the one light in one direction and they sent the other light hundreds of kilometers away. In fact, they put it into outer space. So we have particles, light particles, photons, in two separate locations, but they are what's known as entangled. And when you modify the information on the one particle, the entangled particle simultaneously, with no gap of time between them, changes its spin. And that's called quantum teleportation. The information in one teleports with no separation of time to the other. So how does that relate to relationships? Well, the way I see it is that two people, and Dana Zohar shows in a book that we as human beings are quantum beings. Our brain, in fact, actually operates in a very much in quantum states. And science is only beginning to grasp that. But essentially, when two people come together, they entangle their lives. And there's a connection between people. And as we move more and more together in relationships, so we become more and more entangled. And the way I like to look at it is that that entanglement creates the solidity of this third entity called the quantum relationship, or the beloved, becomes more and more of a tangible being. So the entanglement of our relationships means that we are interconnected. And yes, when we separate, as happens, there's still a connection. And Dana Zohar shows that that connection will always be there. The entanglement will always be there. Once particles have been entangled, they're always connected. And they can actually be, the quantum physics has proven that these particles can be separated by hundreds of kilometers or billions of light years. You can in fact put one particle on the other side of the universe and one particle on this side of the universe, and you modify the state of this particle, and the other particle's state completely changes. So that's the answer on the how does entanglement affect relationships.
Okay, so let's go back to the other questions.
Yeah, Dominic says, what about those of us called to live a celibate life? I find the one in source and through each individual I interact with, but not necessarily a personal love and an intimate other. I totally agree. I mean, just looking, and you and I have had that experience, Andrew, like, we interacted, we've met, we've spent a lot of time together. And yeah, when we look at each other, the love in our friendship that we have, I see the beloved, I see God in you and you see God in me, and, we are not sexually intimate. We just have a friendship and a love. And in that, we cultivate the beloved. We cultivate God, We cultivate an experience of God. So, for those that are called to live a celibate life, or those that are called to be single, as Dominic says, yes, and through each individual I interact with, exactly. Absolutely, Dominic. Through your interactions with everybody, you see God within them, and you create the beloved, and you live and cultivate the beloved in your life.
So we also have another question here. Can one only ask yes or no questions? Can one only ask yes or no questions? I don't think
no, there's all kinds of questions. So I mean, it can be yes and no questions. It can be other questions. And that's something that, as I say, the first phase of my quantum questioning astrology process is to get clear on the question, because sometimes maybe it's not a yes or no answer question that you actually really want to ask. Because if we really talk about the process of aligning with your will, we may actually discover it's not a yes and no question. So yeah, so I take people through a process of getting clear on what the question is. And sometimes it might be just as simple as saying, these are the steps of contemplation you need to follow. I will recommend people on Richard Rudd's YouTube videos around the whole process of contemplation, and I'll take people through what contemplation is. So yeah, it's not just yes or no. There's any kind of question can be answered. If you say to me something like, will I ever get married? Well, the problem with will I ever get married, what does that mean? Do you want to get married? Do you want to meet the one? When do you want to meet the one? Do you want to meet the one in the next 6 months, in the next year, tomorrow? So like there's a number of questions. So what is the question you're really asking? But when you come with a question like, will I ever get married? It's like, that's not the real question.
No.
So that's the process. That's the process I take people through, is to get clear on the question. And when we get clear on the question, we align with the will. And when we align with the will, that's when we create magic. So one of the definitions of magic, in fact, the infamous magician Aleister Crowley, he said the definition of magic is the alignment with will. So creating cause and effect relationships in the physical world with aligning with will. It's when we align with our will that we can create a new reality for ourselves.
There's a nice comment here. So that explains why after 40 years of marriage, we communicate telepathically. Yeah, spot on.
Absolutely, totally.
Myself and my partner, we do that, and we've only been together 2 years. So I can't imagine after 40 years, you know.